إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to episode 4 of this exciting journey through our Islamic history in Europe. And now we've come to the point that we finished the first 3 episodes about Europe. We're going to talk about a continent which I personally feel very, very attracted to, which is the continent of Africa. MashaAllah, Africa is a massive continent, huge. Not the way we look at it. If you look at the map nowadays, Africa is not portrayed the way it should be. It's much bigger than it really is portrayed on the world map. And it is indeed huge and massive. As well as its history, in contrast to what people believe, or what we are made to believe, that Africa has no civilization, has no culture, is backwards, people are just basically poor, starving. This is the ideas that are given to us. This is what we believe Africa is about. It is the total opposite. I guarantee you that. I've been several times to several parts of Africa, and again, because we have one episode about Africa, that does not mean that with one episode we've covered the whole continent. We're talking about 53 countries. Impossible, of course, to cover the whole continent with one episode, and we're not aiming to do that. What I'm aiming to do is just to introduce you the way that Islam spread in Africa, and again go against false claims and myths and narratives that have developed in the last couple of decades or centuries with regards to the Muslims and Islam in Africa. It starts already actually with regards to statistics. If you look at different sources describing Africa and the population in Africa, you see already how different they approach this issue of how big is the population of Africa. As we said, 53 countries. The population of Africa is between 320 million to most probably 400 million plus. It's not, there's conflicting statistics, as I said before, and depending on what source you take, depending on where you're looking into, the population itself has there's a massive gap amongst them. Now, with regards to Muslims and Christians, that's another problem again, because the West likes to portray Africa as This video is sponsored by the 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗡 program. For nearly 7 centuries, Ibn Khaldoun's 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗧𝗢𝗥 has been read and studied by scholars and students of history, sociology, politics and economics as the single most authoritative and astounding work of classical scholarship in the field of history. Embark on an enlightening educational venture led by Muslim scholars and teachers delving into Islamic history, sociology, economics and beyond. Engage with cutting-edge learning cues and multimedia components, allowing for a deeper understanding of the topics. Distinguish between the lies and the truths of the narratives told, between reliable and unreliable sources. Equip yourself with the skills to conduct deep research and build confidence to combat Islamophobia. Come and strengthen your Muslim identity today. Grab the course in the video description. The backyard, especially certain countries in Africa, the colonial powers, they would like to show that Africans actually have accepted Christianity. There are many more Christians in Africa than there are Muslims, for example, which is not correct, not true. Most statistics actually tell you that there are more Muslims even nowadays in Africa than there are Christians. However, Africa as a continent actually was a Muslim continent rather than a Christian one. What do I mean with that? I mean simply, of course, Christianity as an established faith, religion, existed before Islam. So everybody would say it's logical that Christianity had come to Africa before Islam. Logical, right? Now, that's not entirely true. North Africa, as well as the country of Ethiopia, for example, have strong and old Christian communities. Without a doubt, Ethiopia actually is very well known throughout the world of being an Orthodox country, of having an old Christian tradition, without a doubt. Ethiopia and Eritrea. So in East Africa, in certain parts of East Africa and in certain parts of North Africa, certain pockets in North Africa, such as the Copts in Egypt, there you will find some older Christian communities, without a doubt, before Islam. However, with regards to West Africa, Central and Southern Africa, That is entirely the opposite. Islam came to West Africa and the other parts of Africa before Christianity arrived there. Christianity arrived in West Africa and other parts of Africa after the missionaries, after colonization of Africa, and after the missionaries arrived from Europe in these parts and in these countries in Africa. So basically, the majority of the countries in Africa that claim to be Christian nowadays were actually not Christian. They became Christian after Islam had already spread there. Countries such as Tanzania, for example, which used to be an entirely Muslim country, has become nowadays 50-50, if not even more Christians. So the missionary activities have been in the last century very, very strong, and Christian missionaries from Europe arriving in Africa and portraying their religion or putting their Christianity, imposing their Christianity on people is without a doubt has been happening for the last couple of decades, if not even centuries. The presence of Islam in Africa, now let's go back. How did it all start? You know, if we say that Islam had arrived before Christianity, then that means it couldn't have arrived before the 7th century, because that's when the established deen of Islam was there. Prophet Muhammad of course was active in the 7th century, and indeed before the 7th century there was just some pockets in Africa, as I mentioned before, in North Africa and in East Africa, especially in Ethiopia, Eritrea, where you would find the churches and the Christians being active. So what happened in the history of Islam? The Prophet Muhammad advised a number of his early disciples who were facing persecution by the pre-Islamic inhabitants of Mecca to seek refuge across the Red Sea in the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia. Abyssinia, of course, that time the borders that we know nowadays were not the same. Abyssinia was a nation which nowadays is part of Ethiopia, well, modern day Ethiopia and Western Somalia. So that covered these regions. And the ruler of Abyssinia was called al-Najashi. Al-Najashi accepted the Muslims that time, allowed them to stay in his country, allowed them to stay in Abyssinia, and even listened to them. Listened to them and wanted to know, why are they persecuted? Why do they want refuge? What exactly is happening in Arabia? A very important point for us Muslims to realize now finally is that al-Najashi listened to them, and after what they told him about Maryam alayhi salam, this is a very well-known story, after he found out that the Muslims actually are closer to his belief than Christianity is, he said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. And Najashi accepted Islam. And now, the turning point of Islam, definitely in Africa, but in the world as well. The first ruler, have you ever thought of it? The first ruler in the world to accept Islam was an African king. And Najashi was the first ruler in Islam, the first ruler who accepted Islam. Okay? This is amazing, an amazing fact I find, that we have to realize that Islam Africa, an African ruler accepted Islam as the first ruler in the world. The first ruler in the world was an African king. And from there on, it went without a doubt inwards. From there on, East Africa moved on, and as we said before, North Africa, the Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula moved and migrated into North Africa. The Berbers, the indigenous people, the indigenous North African people living in North Africa, accepted Islam within a couple of years. 𝗘𝗔𝗥𝗡 bin Ziyad from nowadays the region of Morocco, he went as a Berber to Al-Andalus, opened Al-Andalus for Islam, brought Islam into Europe. Massive energy. We're talking about from the moment that Africa accepted Islam, Islam was exported into Europe. Subhanallah, have we ever thought of this? Have we ever thought of this, what that actually means? So, North Africa became Muslim. North Africa became Muslim. East Africa became Muslim. How did Islam end up in West Africa? Through trade. There we go again, the sword. Now we're going on with the narrative. You know, Islam was spread by the sword, which again, he has proven wrong. Traders, Arab traders and Berber traders from North Africa kept going with their trade as we were doing before, and they traded with West African nations. So from North Africa, Islam ended in countries such as in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, the Gambia, and so on and so on and so on. And again, we don't have the time, unfortunately, to go deeper into different empires that developed, because we should not forget that actually with Islam, a massive amount of empires developed in Africa, and the energy that we feel in the Islamic history of Africa is amazing. I mean, I could be talking about this one episodes long. So when Islam arrived in East Africa, it did not arrive by the sword. It was not brought to East Africa by some warriors. It was brought by some refugees. SubhanAllah, there we go again, the issue of the refugees. So refugees arrived in East Africa and Abyssinia. The king accepted Islam, and from there on, Islam was introduced in the rest of East Africa. West Africa, through trade. North Africa, the Arabs went to North Africa, but again, nobody forced the Berbers to accept Islam. They did accept Islam slowly, but surely. And once they had accepted Islam, these people went to Europe. Amazing. So, North Europe, South Africa, Trans-Saharan Africa. So basically, from there on, Islam just spread through Africa. That's how simple it is, and that's how easy it is. So I don't see any sword, and I don't see any fighting from that perspective. Which does not mean that, of course, battles happened, of course, but that was because of power reasons. That had to do with people wanting power, with people wanting the throne. These are all things that we can see throughout history, and not only in Africa, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world. The other important point is to mention, maybe in East Africa, especially because of the connection to the Arab world. East Africa is, of course, due to the location, immediately there was trade, there had been trade actually before Islam with the Arabs and with the Arabian Peninsula. Now nowadays we are told, look, what the Europeans did in West Africa mainly, and they took slaves and they took them to America, and they treated them inhumanely. The same thing the Arabs did on the other side in East Africa. This is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. First of all, let's make this clear. The trade relation between East Africa and the Arab world was not only slaves. There were also slaves. Also, the name slave, by the way, just to make this a point again, slave. Have you ever thought of where the name comes from? What does slave actually mean? Slave comes from Slavic people. The Slavic people are the ones that are nowadays on the Balkan Peninsula. These Slavic people were actually the first slaves that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, used to have them as slaves. It was not a color issue. They were actually blonde, blue-eyed, tall people. Okay, so a slave is not somebody who comes from Africa. Originally, a slave was somebody who came from Europe, a Slavic person, okay, who was considered by the Greeks worthy to be a slave. So as the name says itself. So East Africa had, of course, also they were dealing in slaves, but it was not just an African thing. It was just something that Africans were doing amongst themselves. They were dealing with each other in a way of, because of wars, they would exchange slaves. They would take slaves from the losers, or the loser party. The same that they would actually do in Europe in the past. And the Arabs would do exactly the same way. They would deal with it in exactly the same way. So it is not an exclusive thing that was happening in Africa, and it's not something that just the Africans and just the Arabs were doing. Not at all. And now we're going back to before Islam. This happened before Islam. Before the Arabs accepted Islam, before Islam spread in Arabia, there was already trade between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So slaves were exported and taken both ways before Islam. Once Islam came, Islam was there actually to abolish slavery. Islam is not a supporter of slavery in that way. So as an example, so there are many ways that push a Muslim to free a slave rather than take a slave. So Islam did not promote the idea of slavery. So after the Arabian Peninsula and the Arabs accepted Islam, slavery was not, and the slaves were definitely not treated the same way that they were treated before. And it was definitely not a black and white thing, or a black and Arab thing, or an African thing. The island of Zanzibar between the 9th and the 10th centuries, for example, very interestingly enough, the island of Zanzibar, which is nowadays in Tanzania, became the Islamic center of trade. And Islam spread into the interior from there. By the 10th century, the Kilwa Sultanate, founded by Ali ibn al-Hasan Shirazi, a Persian, at the Swahili coast, was spread. Islam in Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti spread quickly by the 10th century. So basically the whole of East Africa, going deeper into East Africa. The Swahili language, by the way, in East Africa, which has become a very big language nowadays. The Swahili language is nothing else but an Arabic Creole. Now, a Creole language, we know Creole languages from the Caribbean. We know Creole languages in South America, in certain parts of Africa. Swahili is basically an Arabic Creole language. It's a development from the Arabic language. And you will see that the vocabulary in Swahili is massive, is very, very huge, very big, taken from the Arabic language. By the 19th century, Islam had gone inwards towards Burundi, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, so slowly Islam developed. Now, by the 19th century, many European missionaries had been there already. That's correct, that's true, and they had reached the Democratic Republic of Congo as well. It was a Belgian colony. Rwanda, Burundi, Belgian colonies. So the Belgians were there. Europeans had reached already that part of the world. However, Islam had established already its roots, had put its roots already in Africa long before the colonialists even arrived in Africa. Another example I want to mention before we finish, the island of Madagascar, a very interesting case, was used as many trading posts were established by Muslim Arabs and by East Africans along the northwest coast of the island. And other Muslim groups established a kingdom in the south. Now, interestingly enough, in the 3rd century already, so before Islam, the original population in Madagascar came from Indonesia. So an amazing situation here now. Again, we're looking into, as we said before, the Hungarians originally, they come from Central Asia, the Huns. The original population of Madagascar are actually Indonesians. And they brought with them also their language. And we can find it nowadays, for example, many words in the Malagasy, in the language of Madagascar, go back to the Indonesian language. And again, the Indonesians have a lot of Arabic elements in there, mashallah. Exciting, these things are, you cannot know if you don't look into history, of course. The Comoros Islands, again, the 4 Comoros Islands which exist nowadays, the name itself is already Arabic, coming from Qamar, the moon. These islands are mainly an Arab Swahili population, as well as Persians. Another interesting case again. Persians and people of Indian origin, Muslims mainly, were doing trade. They settled in these islands, Madagascar as well as Comoros Islands. And one of the official languages of the Comoros Islands is actually Arabic, mashallah. So the majority, of course, Muslims also there. And we can go on like this. One very last point I would like to make. Again, as we said, this is not done with one episode, of course. One very last and important point. Islam spread in Southern Africa, in countries like South Africa, Namibia, maybe even Botswana and Zimbabwe, but mainly South Africa. That's an unbelievable fact, actually. The Dutch, the tiny country in Europe, in Western Europe, of not more than 50 million people, these people had once an empire. And part of the empire was Indonesia. Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world. Another part of the empire was South Africa. Okay, the Dutch went to South Africa and they were fighting the English down there. What happened? The Dutch wanted to get rid of the Indonesian shuyukh who were actually calling for jihad against the Dutch colonialists. So they would take, as soon as they saw people raising their voice in the masjids or raising their voice outside, shuyukh, ulama, they would take them from there and take them to South Africa, put them in the desert, give them a house and leave them there basically to die. What happens? These shuyukh gather slowly black population around them, these black people who of course fled because of the mistreatment by the white settlers in South Africa. They would go to these places because they would find refuge there and they would accept Islam. So Islam in South Africa, subhanallah, Islam in South Africa developed because of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much, Holland. So, mashallah, if we look at these amazing facts, I really think that there's so much to say still, but we have to come to an end, unfortunately. And inshallah, we will look deeper into other continents and other countries as well. Jazakumullah khair. I hope you enjoyed it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.